There's a moment, and I mean a very specific moment, that every single person alive in 2031 remembers. Not where they were when they heard about it. Not when they saw it on a screen, or read it on their phone, or got a panicked call from someone they loved. No, I mean the exact second they felt it. Because that's the thing about the Velthari arrival that nobody talks about enough. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fire and screaming and explosions like every movie ever made had promised us it would be. It was a feeling. Like when a storm is coming and the air pressure drops and the hairs on your arms stand up before you even know why. The world felt heavy. I was in a diner in Tulsa, Oklahoma, eating a plate of eggs I hadn't finished yet, when the coffee in my mug started to vibrate. Little concentric rings spreading outward, like something massive was moving, real slow, real deliberate, something that weighed more than anything we had a word for. The woman behind the counter, Rosa, her name tag said, she looked at the coffee too, then she looked up at me. Her eyes weren't scared yet, they were just confused, like her brain was still trying to find the category for what was happening. That's the thing, our brains weren't ready, not for this. We'd spent decades making movies about aliens. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, aliens that blew up the White House, aliens that dissolved people in green acid, aliens that were secretly just misunderstood. We had a genre for it. We had posters and soundtracks and action figures. But none of that prepared us for the moment when a ship, one ship, entered low orbit over the North American continent, and its shadow covered 3 states. 3 states. I'm not exaggerating. I looked it up later. The lead vessel of the Velthari 7th Expeditionary Fleet, they called it the Korashel, which their own translators later told us means something like inevitable claim, had a surface area larger than the state of Texas. And that was just the one they let us see. My name doesn't matter much. I'm nobody important. Former Army sergeant, 2 tour in places I still don't talk about at dinner. After I got out, I took a job doing private security consulting, which mostly meant I sat in boring meetings and told insurance companies what kind of locks they should put on their server rooms. Glamorous work. But in 2031, when the Velthari fleet arrived and the United Earth Emergency Council started pulling anyone with military experience out of retirement, I got a different kind of call. They needed observers, people who could watch, document, and report accurately without panicking, people who had learned, through very hard experience, to stay functional when everything around them was falling apart. I said yes before the guy on the phone finished his sentence. 3 days later, I was on a transport to a place I'm still technically not supposed to name, standing in front of a wall of screens that showed our planet from orbit, and looking at those shadows. Those massive shadows. And I understood in that moment gut deep, the kind of understanding that skips your brain and goes straight to your spine, that we were in trouble. The Velthari made contact 14 hours after orbital insertion. They were remarkably polite about it, honestly. That was the first thing that threw everyone off. You expect an alien invasion to start with a weapon, a threat, some kind of display of power that makes the message clear, we are stronger, comply. Instead, we got a broadcast. It came through every frequency simultaneously, radio, television, cellular, digital, everything. And it said, translated roughly, inhabitants of the 3rd orbital body of Sol system, we are the Velthari Dominion. We have claimed this system under Galactic Codex Provision 7 Theta, the right of productive worlds. Your cooperation in the transition process will be noted favorably. Resistance is not recommended. Not recommended. Like it was a suggestion, like they were being helpful by mentioning it. I was in the observation room when the council played it back. The room was full of generals and scientists and diplomats who had spent their entire careers preparing for various kinds of catastrophe, and they all just sat there, very quietly. One of the generals, a woman named Hopewell, 3 stars, the kind of person who had looked down a lot of very bad situations and not blinked, she leaned forward in her chair, put her elbows on the table and said, "Not recommended. Okay, what's option 2? Nobody laughed, but a few people smiled, and that mattered. The Velthari didn't wait for a formal response before they began what they called the cataloging phase. What that meant in practice was that smaller scout craft, still enormous by our standards, maybe the size of a football stadium each, descended into the atmosphere over major population centers and began scanning. Just scanning. Not attacking, not landing troops, scanning. They wanted to know what they were dealing with. We later got access to their fleet logs, and that's a story I'll tell you, but in those early translated records, the Velthari commanders described Earth in very specific terms. High-resource world, abundant biological diversity, dominant species, bipedal carbon-based Class 3 intelligence rating, military technology, primitive but dense, estimated pacification timeline, 18 standard cycles, roughly equivalent to 14 local months. Class 3 intelligence, 14 months. That's how long they thought it would take to conquer us. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I know how it sounds. It sounds insulting, and it is. But what I need you to understand is that by the Velthari's standards, and they had conquered 67 worlds before they got to us, 14 months was actually on the generous side. Usually they gave it less time than that. They weren't being cruel. They weren't underestimating us out of arrogance. They genuinely, sincerely believed they had seen everything the universe had to offer in terms of resistance. They were wrong in ways they couldn't have imagined. But we didn't know that yet. In those first days, all we knew was the shadow, the broadcast, and the very quiet, very terrible feeling that the world we'd built, everything we'd built, was about to be taken away from us. Dr. Yemi Okafor was the one who changed everything first. She was a xenolinguist at MIT, which before all of this had been a fairly quiet specialty. There aren't a lot of aliens to study when you're on the only planet you know of with intelligent life. She'd spent 20 years developing theoretical frameworks for how contact with non-human intelligence might work. She'd written 3 books that maybe a few thousand people had read. When the Velthari signal came through, the United Earth Emergency Council was scrambling to find anyone who had thought seriously about any of this. Yemi got a call at 2 in the morning, and she was in Washington by 6. I met her on the 3rd day. She was small, 5'2", maybe, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a look in her eyes like a person doing 4 different calculations at the same time. She had already decoded significant portions of the Velthari language from the initial broadcast and the scanning phase transmissions we'd been intercepting. "They're not talking to each other the way you'd expect," she told me. We were in a corridor in between briefings, eating bad cafeteria sandwiches because there was no time to do anything properly. "Their internal communications, the ones they're not bothering to encrypt because they assume we can't understand them, they're not confident. They're confused." "About what?" She looked at me over her sandwich. "About us, about Earth. The data they're getting from the scans doesn't fit their models." "What data?" She paused, chose her words carefully. The thing about the Velthari Codex, the galactic framework they operate under, is that it's built on assumptions. Assumptions about how civilizations develop, how they organize, what they value. The 67 worlds they conquered, they all fit a recognizable pattern. Technology correlates with social hierarchy. Military strength correlates with centralized authority. You can measure a species and know with reasonable accuracy how they'll fight and how they'll fold. And we don't fit. Not even close. She took a bite of her sandwich, chewed, looked at the wall. They scanned a children's hospital in Mumbai and a military base in Nevada, and their systems couldn't figure out why a species would build both. Why you dedicate equivalent resources to healing individuals who can't fight and also to preparing weapons. Their models assume one or the other. A species that prioritizes survival will militarize. A species that prioritizes community will build social structures but limit aggression. We're doing both, simultaneously at scale. I thought about that. That confuses them. It frightens them, she said, and she wasn't being dramatic. They've never seen it before in 67 worlds, and they've been doing this for 8,000 years. The first real test came 6 weeks after arrival. The Velthari had been patient, methodical, even in their initial approach. They dispatched ground teams to 3 locations, a rural area in the American Midwest, a coastal plain in Southeast Asia, and a stretch of sub-Saharan savannah in Africa. The ground teams were what we'd call advance infantry, soldiers, basically, but in the Velthari system they were called integration units. Their job was to establish a physical presence, assess the local resistance capacity, and begin what the Codex called behavioral alignment. Which meant show up, demonstrate power, watch what the locals do. The Southeast Asia team landed near a village in northern Vietnam. 43 Velthari soldiers, in full battle configuration. The kind of setup that, on any of the 67 worlds they'd visited, would have sent the locals running. The village didn't run. There were maybe 200 people in that village, farmers mostly, some of them elderly, and they stood in a rough semicircle at the edge of the clearing where the Velthari ship set down, and they watched. That's it. They just watched. The Velthari integration leader, we later got his name from the fleet logs, Kelvasht. He described the interaction in his report. He said, "The locals demonstrated no aggression, but they also demonstrated no submission. They maintained position and eye contact. When we advanced, they did not retreat. They held their ground without visible weapons." I asked our behavioral analyst to classify the response, the report continued. The analyst's classification was defiant calm. We have no established protocol for defiant calm. The codex does not contain this category. Kelvash, to his credit, didn't push. He withdrew his unit back to the ship and filed his report. But here's the part of that story that I love, that I think about when things feel hopeless. Later, after all of this was over and the translators got access to Kelvasht's personal journal, which he kept, apparently out of habit, he wrote one additional line about that village. He wrote, "One of the small humans, a child, I believe, waved at me as we left. I do not know what it meant. My translator had no data. But I have been thinking about it for 11 cycles, and I still do not know what to do with it. A child waved at an alien soldier. And it broke something in his certainty. In Nevada, the story was different. The Velthari ground team that deployed near a small desert city made the mistake of landing their scout craft in a field that happened to be about 3 miles from a National Guard depot. Now, and this is important, those Guard units had been told to observe and document, not engage. Strict orders from the top of the chain all the way down. Because the Council's position at this stage was that we needed information before we needed bullets. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. But there's a difference between an order not to engage and an order to hide. The Guard captain, his name was Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran from El Paso who had a reputation for being either admirably calm or infuriatingly stubborn, depending on who you asked. He drove out to the edge of that field in a civilian pickup truck with 3 of his soldiers. No weapons visible. No markings on the truck. Just 4 people in work clothes, standing by a fence line, watching a ship the size of an office building settle into the dirt. The Velthari came out. Their ground team was larger here, 60 soldiers, and they were in what we'd later classify as full combat configuration, armor, weapons, signal jammers. Webb told me about it later. He said the Velthari soldiers walked toward them, and he told his people to hold. They didn't know what to do with us either, he said. We were sitting in his cramped office at the depot 18 months after all this happened, and he had that quality some veterans have, not haunted exactly, just very far away when he talked about certain things. They stopped about 30 meters out and I could see them. I mean, obviously I couldn't see their faces, their helmets were sealed, but I could see in the way they were standing that they were conferring, trying to figure us out. And you just stood there. I leaned on the fence, he said, like I was watching a neighbor do something mildly interesting in their yard. He paused, drank his coffee. One of them stepped forward, big one, clearly the senior. He had a device, translation device, we figured out later, and he said something. It came out garbled, but later the linguists told us he'd been trying to say, "This territory is now claimed." "What did you say back?" Webb set his mug down, looked at me. I said, "Son, that field's been claimed by a Hereford cow named Dolars for the last 9 years. You'll have to take it up with her." I stared at him. His translator broke down, Webb said. Literally, the unit overloaded. They had to retreat to recalibrate it. Took 40 minutes. Because of the cow joke. Because of the cow joke. He picked up his coffee again. You can't build a translation algorithm for dry humor if you've never met a human before. I think we ruined their whole database. The African deployment was the one that became a turning point. Not because of a battle. There wasn't one, not then. But because of what the Velthari encountered there, in that stretch of open savannah that forced the first real crisis meeting on their command ship. The integration team deployed near a traditional community in a remote area. The community had minimal modern technology by global standards, solar panels, some satellite communication, a medical relay system. They were, by most definitions, isolated. The Velthari Codex dictated a very specific approach to what they called pre-technological populations. You show up, you demonstrate power, the locals defer, simple. What happened instead? The community elder, a man in his late 70s named Samuel Ape, who had been a professor of philosophy at Lagos University before he retired to his ancestral land, walked out alone to meet the Velthari team. He brought nothing with him but a wooden walking stick and a thermos of tea. He sat down in the grass directly in front of the lead soldier, and he said in English, because he knew the translators would be listening, "You've come a very long way. You must be tired. Sit with me for a while." The Velthari didn't sit, but they didn't advance either. And Samuel Ape sat in that grass for 3 hours in the heat with 60 alien soldiers surrounding him, and he talked. He told them about his village, about his grandchildren, about the drought 2 years ago that almost broke them and the way they rebuilt. He told them about a lion that had been spotted near the perimeter of the community 3 seasons back, and how the men had sat up 3 nights running, not to kill it, but to understand its movements so they could both share the land safely. He told them about the lion, to the alien soldiers. I have a transcript of it. I've read it many times, and every time I read it, I think, Samuel Ape understood something that we hadn't consciously articulated yet. He understood that the Velthari were used to 2 kinds of response, fight or submit, and he was refusing to do either. He was doing something else entirely. He was just being human, completely, thoroughly, overwhelmingly human. The integration commander's report from that deployment contains the most remarkable sentence I have ever read in a military document from any species. The elder spoke for an extended period about a large predatory animal in a tone that suggested respect rather than fear. We have no classification for this. Recommend immediate consultation with Xenopsychology Division. This world's dominant species may not process threat in a way our models can predict. 6 weeks after the fleet arrived, the Velthari High Command did something they had never done in 67 conquests. They paused. Their fleet didn't leave, their ships didn't fire, but the integration timeline was quietly pushed back. And a request went out, through channels we'd intercepted, and Yemi was now fluent enough to read, for a formal communication session with Earth's leadership. Not a demand, not an ultimatum. A request. I was in the room when that transmission was decoded. I watched Yemi's face when she read it. She looked up from her screen, and she had the expression of someone who has just seen something impossible and is deciding whether to be afraid of it or not. "They want to talk," she said. General Hopewell, from her seat at the head of the table, said, "Good, let's see what they want to say." The formal session was held aboard the Corashal, their request, their ship, their terms, technically. But they agreed to a small human delegation of 12 people, and they agreed to provide full atmospheric compatibility for the meeting chamber, and they agreed to a simultaneous translator feed that both sides could monitor. The delegation included 3 generals, 4 scientists, Yemi among them, 2 diplomats, and 3 people they wanted for reasons that weren't immediately obvious. A pediatric surgeon from Kenya, a coal miner from West Virginia, a 17-year-old girl named Priya who had been photographed standing alone in front of a Velthari scout craft in Mumbai, arms crossed, refusing to move. I'll tell you about each of them, but first let me tell you about that ship. I wasn't in the delegation. I was on a support team, and I got within visual range of the entry point before the 12 went up. And I want to tell you what it looked like from the ground when that shuttle from the Corashal came down to collect them. It wasn't like any shuttle in any movie. It didn't roar. It didn't burn. It moved the way water moves around a stone in a stream, smoothly, inevitably, with a kind of physical confidence that had nothing to do with aggression. It settled about 200 meters from the delegation, and a door opened, and the air pressure changed in a way I could feel in my teeth. And the 12 of them walked toward it. I watched them go. 12 human beings, walking toward something that had come from a star 47 light-years away, that commanded a fleet capable of sterilizing everything on this planet. And they walked like they were late for a meeting they'd been waiting their whole lives to attend. That's the thing about humans. When you actually corner us, when you take away the option of running, we walk toward things. The meeting lasted 9 hours. I'm going to tell you the parts that matter. The Velthari delegation was led by an individual the translators rendered as Fleet Speaker Voranathas, a senior member of the Dominion's diplomatic caste. He was, by human aesthetic standards, alarming. Tall, thin in the wrong places, with eyes that seemed to refocus independently of each other. But he spoke carefully. He had clearly studied the preliminary translations, and he opened the session with something that nobody in the human delegation expected. He apologized. Not for the invasion, not yet, but he said, and Yemi told me she triple-checked this translation, we have observed that our scanning process caused disruption to local biological cycles in coastal regions. This was not intended. We regret the disruption. A few of the whales had beached themselves in the days after the fleet arrived, apparently responding to the electromagnetic disruption from the scanning ships. Voranathas had looked that up. He had looked up the specific biological impact on marine mammals, and he had opened the most important diplomatic meeting in human history by acknowledging it. General Hopewell said, "We appreciate that." And the meeting began. Voranathas explained the codex, not defensively, almost academically. He walked the human delegation through the 8,000-year history of the Velthari Dominion, the legal framework for the right of productive worlds, the process by which 67 species had been integrated into the Dominion's structure. Most of those species, he said, are thriving. Dr. Aukefer asked if she could speak with any of them. There was a pause. Voranathas said this was not standard practice during an active integration. Dr. Aukefer said, "I understand, I'm asking anyway." Another pause. "We will consider the request," Voranathas said. She made a note. The pediatric surgeon, Dr. Adiz Nwachukwu, had been quiet for the first several hours. Then she asked to speak. She had, she said, a question about Velthari reproductive biology and life cycle, not for any strategic reason, she clarified, just because she was a doctor and she was curious. Voranathas was visibly surprised, but he answered. They talked for 40 minutes about the way Velthari young develop, which is apparently a deeply private topic in Velthari culture. One of their highest-ranking religious customs is centered around what they call the fragile season, the period when their offspring are most vulnerable. Voranathas had never discussed it with an outsider before. Dr. Nwachukwu listened. She asked careful questions. At one point she said, "That sounds terrifying, actually, that period of helplessness. We have something similar. Humans are profoundly helpless for the first years of life. It shapes everything about how we think about protection." Another pause, this one longer. "We did not know this," Voranathas said. "We're very open about it," she said. "It's one of the reasons we built so many hospitals." The coal miner's name was Roy Delaney. He was from a small county in West Virginia. He'd been working underground since he was 21, and he'd spent the last decade doing union organizing when he wasn't digging. He'd been included in the delegation because someone in the council had the instinct, brilliant, as it turned out, that the Velthari's models of human civilization were based entirely on what they'd observed from orbit. They'd seen cities and military bases and agricultural land. They hadn't seen what humans did in the dark. Roy Delaney was invited to speak about his work. He talked for 35 minutes about what it was like to be underground, about the sounds, the way sound carries differently when you're 1,000 feet below the surface, about the trust that exists between miners, the way you learn to read the mountain, to listen to it, to understand what the creak of a support timber means versus what it means when it makes a different sound. About the man lifts and the escape routes and the way every miner has a headlamp and knows exactly where the emergency air supply is. Always, every single shift. "You plan for it," Roy said. "You plan for the worst thing, not because you're scared, though you are scared, I won't lie to you, but because planning for it is how you get through your day. It's how you go down into the dark and come back up." He paused, then, "A lot of us have been going down into the dark for a very long time. We're pretty good at it." The Velthari side of the table was quiet. Then one of the secondary delegates, a lower-ranked officer, asked a question that Voranathas seemed to consider inappropriate, because he made a gesture that the translators flagged as possibly a reprimand. But the question was already out. "Why do you continue to go down? If it is dangerous and frightening, why do you not find a different way?" Roy looked at the officer, then he said, Because it matters, because people need what's down there, and because somebody's gotta do it. He shrugged, sat back. I'm from West Virginia, he added. We don't stop. And then there was Priya. Priya Mehta, 17 years old, from Mumbai, who had stood in front of a Velthari scout craft with her arms crossed and refused to move. She hadn't been protesting. She told everyone who asked. She hadn't been making a statement. She'd been on her way to school, and the craft had landed in the street she needed to cross, and she'd had a chemistry exam, and she didn't have time to go around. She'd stood there for 20 minutes until the craft moved. The Velthari delegation had footage of it. They'd flagged it during the scanning phase. They'd studied it. They'd run behavioral analysis on it for 6 weeks. They didn't understand it at all. At the meeting, Voranathas, and this took courage, I think, for a being of his authority and age, said directly to Priya, "We observed your behavior near Unit 746 in Sector Mumbai Northeast. Our analysts could not classify your motivation. Would you explain it?" Priya looked at him. She was the youngest person in the room by 2 decades. She didn't look nervous. She looked, if anything, slightly impatient. "I had an exam," she said. "You were not afraid of the unit." "I was absolutely terrified," she said. "But I had an exam, and if I failed it, my professor was going to make me take it again in the summer, and I already had plans." Voranathas said, "You were frightened, but you did not retreat." "Yeah. Why?" Priya thought about it. "Because being frightened doesn't mean stopping. It just means your body knows something is hard. You still have to do the thing." The room was quiet. Then Voranathas said, and Yemi told me this was the moment everything changed, this specific sentence. "In 67 worlds, we have never encountered a species that describes courage as the normal response to ordinary difficulty. For your people, it appears to be a baseline condition." Priya shrugged. Yeah. The session ended without resolution. Which sounds like failure, but it wasn't. Because when the human delegation came back down, something was different. Not in the Velthari's position. They hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't withdrawn, hadn't changed their operational status, but in the quality of the silence. They were thinking. Yemi told me about it on the transport back. She was looking out the window at the sky, and I asked her what she felt. "They came here thinking we were another world to add to a list," she said. "And somewhere in those 9 hours, it started to dawn on them that we might be something else entirely. Something that can beat them." She shook her head slowly. "Something that can't be processed. They have a system for everything, a codex, a framework. Every species they've ever met fits somewhere in the framework, and we don't fit. Not even close." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what the xenopsychology report from the Savannah deployment said? The one about Samuel Ape?" "I read it." "The final line," she said. "They wrote, 'This species may require a category of its own.'" She turned from the window to look at me. Her glasses were smudged. She'd been wearing the same clothes for 2 days. She looked tired and sharp and electric all at once. "That's not a military assessment," she said. "That's a philosophical crisis." 3 months after arrival, something happened that the Velthari fleet commanders later described, in their own records, as statistically unprecedented. Earth pushed back. Not militarily, not first. Our weapons technology was, there's no kind way to say this, the equivalent of throwing rocks at something that can move mountains. We knew it. The military leadership knew it. We weren't going to win an arms race in 3 months against a civilization that had been building weapons systems for 8,000 years. What we did instead was something the Velthari had no framework for. We got creative. It started with the communication systems. The Velthari had been broadcasting codex information across all frequencies, their standard protocol for integration. Information about the new administrative structure, the resource allocation process, the behavioral expectations for integrated species. Most of it was designed to be absorbed passively, to create a psychological environment of inevitability. A 14-year-old named Damaris Osai in Accra, Ghana, figured out how to interrupt those broadcasts and insert music. She was a hobbyist radio operator. Her grandfather had taught her, and she spent 3 days reverse engineering the Velthari broadcast frequency from her bedroom. Then she started inserting 90-second audio clips of traditional Ghanaian highlife music into the gaps in their transmission cycles. It took the Velthari 2 weeks to find the source, by which point communities all over the world were doing the same thing. Jazz from New Orleans, throat singing from Tuva, flamenco from Andalusia, pop music from Seoul, Qawwali from Lahore. The Velthari frequency was becoming a global radio station of human expression, and every time they patched a gap, someone found another one. Their communications officer's report to Fleet Speaker Voronatha's was, according to their log, "We cannot stop it. The population is inserting non-functional data into our administrative channels at a rate that suggests coordinated action, but our surveillance indicates it is occurring independently, without central coordination, across all geographic sectors. We have no mechanism to suppress spontaneous expression at this scale. No mechanism to suppress spontaneous expression at this scale." I love that sentence. I love it so much. Dr. Miriam Vasquez was a materials scientist at Caltech who had spent 20 years working on problems that nobody thought were urgent. Things like, how do you build structures that can withstand pressure systems no human architect has ever encountered? How do you engineer materials that respond to dynamic force rather than resisting it? Very theoretical stuff. Very esoteric. When the Velthari scanning ships began to interfere with Earth's electrical grid, not deliberately, but as a side effect of their scan frequency, Miriam Vasquez had a very specific idea. She'd been working on a concept called resonance dissipation. Basically, the idea that instead of blocking an incoming energy force, you design a surface that absorbs it and redirects it as harmless vibration, like a sail instead of a wall. Applied to the Velthari scan frequency, it would mean that instead of the scans disrupting our electrical systems, we could use the scan energy itself to power our systems. She built a proof of concept in her garage in 3 weeks. It worked. Within 3 months, distributed versions of her dissipation panels were being field deployed across 6 countries. The Velthari scanning ships were inadvertently providing supplemental power to the communities they were scanning. The Velthari technical report on this flagged to the High Command. Planet has begun parasitically drawing energy from our scanning process. This is not possible under standard physics models for a Class 3 technological civilization. Requesting guidance. Standard physics models for a Class 3 civilization. We'd broken their model. We hadn't even been trying to break their model. Miriam Vasquez had just been trying to keep the lights on. There was, in all of this, a moment that became something of a symbol. About 4 months in, a Velthari ground unit was moving through a rural area in rural Appalachia, deep mountain country, narrow roads, steep terrain. Their vehicles were extremely sophisticated, but they'd been designed for flat terrain and open plains because that's what the Velthari engineers had assumed they'd encounter. The mountains were giving them serious trouble. A local man, his name was Harold. He was 70 years old. He ran a small logging operation and had been watching the Velthari unit struggle with the mountain roads for about 40 minutes from his porch, walked down to the road. He waved at the lead vehicle. It stopped. He pointed at the vehicle's front axle configuration. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pulled out a piece of paper and drew something with a pencil stub from his shirt pocket. He handed it to the nearest Velthari soldier. It was a diagram of how to adjust the vehicle's suspension geometry to handle steep switchback terrain. Based on the principles, he'd learned keeping his old logging trucks running on these same roads for 50 years. The Velthari technical team analyzed the diagram. It was correct. They implemented the adjustment. Their vehicles moved more effectively. Harold waved at them again and went back to his porch. Somewhere in the fleet, this event was logged. The log entry was 3 words: population is helpful. I think about Harold a lot, because he didn't do it to be strategic. He didn't do it to ingratiate himself with the occupying force. He just looked at a machine that wasn't working right and he knew how to fix it, and it bothered him to see something broken that he could help, so he helped. That's the thing about humans. We can't stop helping. It's practically involuntary. 5 months after arrival, the Velthari High Command made a decision that had no precedent in the Dominion's 8,000-year history. They requested a second formal session, and they expanded the human delegation. Not from 12 people to 20, not from 12 to 30. They asked for 100 humans, from as many different backgrounds as possible. When I heard that, I felt something shift, something I couldn't name at first, not hope exactly. It was more like the beginning of understanding that a thing I'd been afraid of might be turning, slowly, into something I hadn't had a word for yet. Because you don't ask to know more about something you're planning to simply take. The second session was held over 3 days. Not on their ship this time, they came down to a facility we'd hastily built in Iceland, which had been chosen because it was geologically interesting, and the Velthari had expressed curiosity about it. They brought 17 of their own delegation. We brought 100 humans. A retired astronaut, a street food vendor from Bangkok who had been feeding people in her alley for 30 years, a structural engineer from Brazil who had spent her career building schools in places that had never had them, a farmer from Punjab who could talk for hours about soil, a deep-sea researcher who had been living on a submersible for 6 months a year for the last decade, a conflict mediator from Northern Ireland who had spent 30 years in rooms where people were trying very hard not to kill each other, a comedian from Chicago whose only job had ever been to make people laugh. The comedian almost broke the session. His name was Dennis, and he spent 20 minutes doing material about the invasion, jokes about crop circles, about probing, about alien customer service, and the Velthari delegation, who had never encountered comedy as a deliberate social technology before, went absolutely still. Voranathas, who was back, and who I was beginning to think of as someone I might actually respect, said to Yemi, "He is saying things that are frightening, and they are responding with laughter. The fear-to-laughter pathway, is this normal for your species?" Yemi said, "Yes, we do it to cope. We do it to survive things that are too big to face directly." Voranathas was quiet. "Then we have nothing like this." Yemi said, "I know. I think that's one of the things you need to understand about us." On the second day of the session, the Velthari did something that nobody expected. They asked to see Earth. Not from the air, not from orbit. They wanted to walk on it. Voranathas and 4 members of his delegation with an escort of 20 humans took a half-day to walk along a coastal trail in Iceland. Black sand beach, mountains, geothermal steam venting from fissures in the rock, Arctic terns diving, the smell of sulfur and cold ocean. I wasn't there for this part, but I have the account from one of the escorts, a marine biologist named Luciana, who ended up walking alongside Voranathas for most of the trail. She said he didn't say much at first. He walked and looked. His sensory range was different from ours. She could tell he was perceiving things she wasn't. Frequencies, textures. But he was also clearly responding to things she could perceive. The color of the water, the sound of the birds, the way the ground vibrated faintly from the geothermal activity below. After about an hour, he said, "This world has been alive for a very long time." Luciana said, "About 4.5 billion years, as best we can tell." "And your species, you have only been here for?" "A geological instant, 200,000 years roughly for our species. Civilization, as we'd recognize it, maybe 10,000. Voranathas was quiet for a while. Then, "In 10,000 years you went from small groups moving on foot to building structures that can reach orbit." "We were in a hurry," Luciana said. "Why?" She thought about that, because there was so much to know. And we kept finding out how much we didn't know yet, and that made us want to know more. Another pause. "That is not a motivation our models account for," Voranathas said. "Curiosity as a primary driver of technological development. In our records, technology develops from necessity. Survival pressure, resource scarcity. You developed it from wanting to understand things." "Mostly, yes. Even things that have no practical application." "Especially those," Luciana said. She told me later that Voranathas stopped walking for a moment after that. Just stood there, looking out at the water. Then he said, "We may have made a significant error in our preliminary assessment of this world." The third day of the session was when the Velthari delegation asked to speak privately, just Voranathas and Yemi, 1 translator each. I wasn't in that room. Neither was anyone else from our side. Yemi told me about it afterward in her hotel room in Reykjavik, sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes off and her translation logs spread around her. Voranathas had said, "I am authorized to share with you that the High Command has been in consultation for 3 of your weeks about this situation. This is unprecedented. In 67 integrations, we have never paused more than 4 cycles to reassess." Yemi said, I know. You know because you intercepted our communications. Yes, and you're telling me this directly. I thought you deserved to know we've been listening. Another long pause. You are a very strange species, Voronatha said, and the way Yemi described it, the way he said it, it wasn't dismissive. It wasn't insulting. It sounded like someone saying something true that they'd only just figured out. We know, Yemi said. I have a question, Voronatha said, and I want to be clear that I am asking it as an individual, not as fleet speaker. As an individual who has spent 6 months studying your world and does not yet feel he understands it. Ask. Why do you keep going? He said. This is the question I cannot resolve. You are small, your lives are short. Your world has faced catastrophes, natural, self-inflicted, repeatedly. You have harmed each other in ways that our records indicate would have destroyed the social cohesion of any other species we have encountered. And yet, you build more, you create more, you go deeper and farther and higher, you send music into space. You make paintings in dark caves before you even have written language. You make jokes about things that terrify you. You wave at strangers. He paused. Why do you keep going? Yemi said she didn't answer right away. She sat with the question. Then she said, because we love things, we love a ridiculous number of things. The world and the people in it and the ideas we haven't thought of yet. And when you love things, stopping isn't really an option. She said Voronatha's was quiet for a very long time after that. Then he said, I will be recommending to the High Command that this world be reclassified. Reclassified how? Not as a target, not as a resource. He paused as an anomaly. The outcome, the Velthari Dominion did not leave Earth on a specific day. It was more gradual than that, more complicated than a dramatic reversal, which is what we'd hoped for and what the movies would have given us. The fleet remained in the system for 8 more months after the Iceland sessions. There were ongoing negotiations. There were incidents. A Velthari patrol unit and a group of armed resistance fighters in the mountains of Georgia clashed, and people died on both sides, and it almost undid everything. There were moments when the whole thing nearly fell apart. But it didn't fall apart. The High Command of the Velthari Dominion issued a formal communiqué 14 months after the initial arrival. In Velthari legal tradition, it was a document of extraordinary significance. The first time in the Dominion's history that an integration process had been formally suspended. The official language was bureaucratic. It cited anomalous cultural metrics and insufficient data for standard codex application, and recommended reclassification pending extended observation period. But Yemi translated the underlying passage, the one written in the Velthari equivalent of informal language, the one not intended for public record, and it said, This species does not fit. We have tried to understand them and we cannot, not fully, not yet. They are small and brief and they carry something our instruments cannot measure. They are afraid and they go forward anyway. They are broken in ways that should have stopped them and they build anyway. They have seen darkness that would have silenced any other species and they make art about it and then they go looking for more darkness to understand. We do not have a word for this. We have consulted our entire lexical archive and we do not have a word for this. They cannot be integrated into the Dominion. Not because they would resist, though they would resist relentlessly, joyfully, with terrible creativity, but because the Dominion is not large enough for what they are. We do not mean this in terms of space. We mean it in terms of category. Recommend, withdraw, establish contact protocol, learn more. We have been claiming worlds for 8,000 years, and we have never encountered one that made us question whether we were the most significant thing in the room. Earth makes us question this. Earth makes us question many things. That may be the most important thing it has ever done. The last Velthari ship left the Sol system on a Thursday. Mid-morning, clear sky. I was outside when it happened. I don't think I was the only one standing in a parking lot, or on a porch, or on a rooftop, looking up at a sky that was about to be ours again. It was quiet, that's what I remember. After 14 months of heavy air and weird pressure and the constant, low-grade vibration of ships the size of states hanging above us, there was silence. The particular silence of something massive that has moved away. Rosa from the diner in Tulsa called me that afternoon. She got my number somehow, I don't remember how. She said, "Do you still have eggs you didn't finish?" I laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unprepared. "I think I do," I said. "You should finish them," she said. "Then order more, it's a good day for eggs." Somewhere in a fleet 47 light-years away and moving, Fleet Speaker Voronathas was writing in his personal journal. I know this because Yemi has stayed in contact with him. They built something in those sessions that the Dominion's own protocols had no category for either. A friendship, maybe, something like one. He sent her a copy of the last entry, months later. It said, "I have been thinking about the child who waved. In Integration Unit 7, Northern Vietnam Deployment, Day 1. A small human child who saw armed soldiers of the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy and waved at them." I asked Kelvasht what he had done when the child waved. He told me he had frozen. His entire unit had frozen. They had not known what to do. Today I think I understand what the child was doing. The child was not naive. Children are rarely naive in the ways adults imagine. The child was doing what humans do. It was acknowledging something, saying, "I see you. You exist. We are both here. That is a fact, and facts deserve recognition." We spend 8,000 years claiming worlds, and we never once simply acknowledge the beings on them. Not really. Not as individuals who had something to say. One child with a wave taught me more about what we were doing wrong than 67 conquests, taught us about how to do it right. I am going to think about that for a very long time. We never did find out exactly all the worlds the Velthari had visited before us. We got some records. Enough to know we weren't the only ones, weren't the worst treated, weren't entirely alone in a universe that had forgotten us. But we were the only ones the Velthari ever left. The only ones they ever walked away from still intact, still sovereign, still ourselves. Not because we beat them. Not because we were stronger. But because we were too human to lose. Because when the ship landed, we didn't run. We stood in a semicircle with our hands at our sides. We drove pickups to the field. We sat in the grass and talked about lions. We stood in front of craft the size of buildings because we had places to be. We went underground in the dark because it mattered. We played music on their frequencies. We drew diagrams on paper. We made jokes about the things that terrified us. We helped with the machine that wasn't working. We waved. We kept waving. And somewhere in all of that, in all that stubborn, generous, creative, frightened, joyful, impossible humanity, something in the universe's oldest empire quietly recalibrated. Found a new category. Filed us under something it had never needed before. Under, do not underestimate, do not dismiss, do not take. Approach with care. They are worth knowing. I eat my eggs every morning now. I finish them. I look at the sky, the empty sky, our sky, and I think about all the things we didn't know we were, until something from somewhere else showed up to tell us. I think about Samuel Ape in the grass, Roy Delaney in the dark, Priya with her arms crossed, Harold with his pencil and his diagram, Damaris with her radio, a child waving at the end of the world. I think about how, when everything was at stake, the thing that saved us wasn't a weapon. It was us. Just all of us, being human as hard as we knew how. And it turned out that was the hardest thing in the galaxy to conquer.